Good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Doug Mitchell, and I have the great privilege of being the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy. And I will tell you, this is one of my very favorite nights of the year. Tonight, we have a very special opportunity to, as I said, go behind the scenes to hear about some of the critical work private philanthropy is making possible right here in Glacier National Park. Each one of you has contributed in a meaningful way, and together that has allowed the Conservancy, listen to this for a minute, has allowed the Conservancy to support over $3 million in projects just this year, and to pledge to support an additional $3 million in projects next year. Thank you. It's absolutely incredible. And this work that you help fund, well, it's only possible because of the dedicated people in green and gray. Without them and their work, there would be no projects for us to support. They are the hands on the ground restoring native fish, creating accessible trails, and giving high fives to young people getting off buses for an inspirational field trip here in Glacier. These are today's and tomorrow's leaders, inspiring themselves and others through a professional experience that's only possible because of your generous support and through this growing community of caring. Thank you so much for investing in people, in place, and in the promise of preserving Glacier Park for future generations. We're going to hear tonight from 5 of these transformational leaders in Glacier National Park. Chris Downs is going to talk to us about the work he's been doing in the area of native fish restoration, dear to me as a fisherman. Holly Holmes and Lisa Bate are going to take us behind the scenes in their groundbreaking work using new tools to study avian species here in Glacier. And Perry Sassnet and Michael Feist will take us backstage at the award-winning Headwaters podcast. These are projects with which you will be familiar from our most recent project funding needs guide, one of these, which you probably got in the mail recently. If you've not gotten one, just email me at doug@glacier.org and we'll make that happen. And we'll also put a link into the chat if that's easier to just download it tonight. So here's how this is going to work. Each of our guests has put together a presentation, and while you're enjoying those, please send in questions using the chat feature. Send those to Lacey Kowalski, the Associate Director for Programs and Policy here at the Conservancy. You'll see in the chat you can choose Lacey. Send those questions to her, and she'll be managing the chat and keeping track of all the questions that she'll moderate that we'll do at the end of all of the presentations. Thank you, Lacey, for doing that for us tonight. And also to my coworkers, Andrew Smith and Stacy Dubuque, who are helping out with all the technology tonight. So, okay, are you ready? Because we're going to get started. Let's start first with fish. Chris Downs is the Aquatic and Physical Science Programs Manager here in Glacier Park, and has been working on native fish restoration and watershed protection for more than a decade. His work's been featured on Montana Public Radio, and he's been recognized by Trout Unlimited for his work both here in Glacier and beyond. Chris, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, my pleasure, Doug.
We really appreciate the work you do, and I know you've had some of our team out there with you this year, and thanks so much for that and for putting together a presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, my friend.
Thank you, Doug. And just to note, it's not very often that I get to be with 2 different people who catch their first fish with me on a boat on Quartz Lake. So that was kind of rewarding to be with your staff to have that happen as well. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, they came up and helped us do some of our lake trout work on Quartz Lake. Just to echo what Doug has said already, I use this title because much of the important work we do couldn't be accomplished without the funding support of donors to the Conservancy and the Conservancy board members and staff themselves. So I'd like to start with a big thank you to everyone on this call for your assistance in a number of different ways. Next slide, please. So there are tough challenges currently facing some park animals, particularly those that require cold temps and snow and ice. From an aquatics perspective, these 2 fishes, the bull trout and the West Slope cutthroat trout, are emblematic of the challenges facing the park's cold water aquatic ecosystems. These two species require among the coldest water temperatures of any salmonid species. And generally speaking, Glacier has a lot of cold water, but because of some of the challenges that we're seeing and the changes we're seeing in our climate, things are changing. And just to emphasize how cold these critters like it, they like water. Their I guess thermal optima, or the way they basically function is best at about 55 degrees. That's when their feed's most efficient, their growth is most efficient, and that's really cold by a lot of standards. We have waters in the park that reach 60, 70 degrees. So the fact that these animals need a lot of cold water is important, and particularly as we consider climate change. Next picture. So the issues are that climate's driving some shifts in precipitation patterns. We're getting more rain than snow. Hydrology, we're getting runoff earlier, and water temperatures are reducing overall habitat suitability. They have the ability to adapt over time, and they've shown that over thousands of years, but the rate at which things are changing, we talk about climate seems to be changing, almost on a every few years, things are getting warmer, but evolution takes place over generations. And some of the work we're doing is simply trying to buy them time so that they can still exist in strong enough populations that they'll have the ability to adapt over time. And some of the issues that occur because of climate change create favorable conditions for some of our invasive non-native species, such as rainbow, brook, and lake trout, at the expense of our native fish. For example, rainbow trout spawn in warmer water temperatures. They spawn earlier. They do better when we don't have these really large spring runoff events. That helps them with their reproduction. They're starting to hybridize with our native fish because the change of timing of runoff puts them right on top of cutthroat trout spawning as well. Brook trout, they also do like cold water, but because they mature earlier, our native fish are put at a disadvantage due to warming water temperatures, but brook trout are still doing just fine and reproducing at younger ages. And lake trout, well, they're quite a bit different than bull trout. Bull trout spawn in streams, and lake trout spawn in lakes. So they're definitely more insulated from changes due to climate change, like midwinter floods that might wash out bull trout spawning nests. Lake trout spawn in lakes. We're probably going to have a lot of cold water in those lakes for a long time, just because lakes stratify in the summertime, and they just don't have to migrate. So they're at competitive advantages. So we have climate-driven issues adversely impacting native fish. And at the same time, the non-native invasive fish are able to take advantage of those things and gain advantage over native fish. Whether you say it's competition or predation, they're just at an advantage in a number of different ways. Next slide. So how do we help native fish? There's a couple of different approaches that we've been working on, and I've been at the park here for 15 years, and before that I was with Idaho Fish and Game for 10 years, and we were working on some of the same issues, trying to mitigate the adverse effects of invasive species, because it's sort of synergistic. We have climate change changing habitat and favoring non-native species through a whole host of different ways, because temperature controls so many things in the environment, particularly the aquatic environment, that there were so many different strings that are being pulled that affect things in different ways. But at the most basic sense, what we could do is try and take some of these other stressors off of them. And what we've been trying to do essentially is like, weeding a garden or spraying weeds on the side of the road. We're trying to keep non-native fish at a level where they don't adversely impact our native fish populations, and it takes management. We're right now removing lake trout using this commercial gill netting boat that we had built a number of years ago by some folks in the Great Lakes, because for those of you who know a little bit about ecology or history or fisheries of the Great Lakes, they were able to collapse lake trout by overfishing in giant lakes. So their thought was, if we can do it in these lakes that are, tens of thousands, if not more, surface acres, you ought to be able to do it on one that's just 2 miles long. And it's hard to argue with that logic. So that's what we've been doing, and native fish have been benefiting. And one of the nice things that's come of this is through conservancy funding. We've established a relationship with our local community college that has a natural resource technician program. And the person on the right, Sally, was our intern for this year, and she did a great job. So we're getting a lot of great help, and yet we're also building that bridge to the next generation of park stewards through training. And we're seeing, definite evidence that our native fish are benefiting from our efforts, particularly in Quartz Lake. Generally speaking, when lake trout move into a system, it's only a matter of decades, 20, 30 years before they basically push bull trout to functional extinction. And we've been at this now for 15, 16 years, and native fish are holding strong. The populations haven't declined, and it's really a great fishery. And again, I'll mention that that's where the two folks that came out to photograph some of our work caught their first fish. And I actually think we caught one first fish that was actually a bull trout, which is, I imagine, pretty special. So next slide. Another one of our projects is a cutthroat conservation effort in the upper Missouri River drainage. So West Slope cutthroat are down now to about 2% of their historic distribution of genetically unaltered fish that haven't been hybridized. And these fish are really ranked high for priority in the state of Montana's cutthroat conservation perspective, the Forest Service. They're Montana's state fish. They were described by Lewis and Clark at the Falls of the Missouri. And interestingly enough, the southern boundary of Glacier National Park, where it separates from the forest at Marias Pass, is the likely spot where West Slope cutthroat first crossed the divide from the west side of the Continental Divide to the east side, and then those populations radiated out into the upper Missouri system. But unfortunately, many of those are fragmented at low abundance due to competition with non-native brook trout and hybridization with rainbow trout. But what we have, though, is until recently, we had a population just over the divide in Midvale Creek that was one of the last remaining unaltered populations of West Slope cutthroat trout remaining in that entire Rocky Mountain front. Unfortunately, rainbow trout compromised the system through the irrigation works that were protecting them through an irrigation dam in East Glacier. So now we're working to remove the hybrids and protect the remaining genetically pure fish because they're of such high conservation value. There just aren't many of them left. And frankly, on the east side of the park, this is the only population that until recently didn't have any hybridization in it. And it's a particular conservation value to not only the park, it's a transboundary stream. So we manage one part of it and the Blackfeet manage the other part of it. And we have a partnership in this project to go in and try and conserve these fish and then potentially get them out of harm's way if we can't get all the rainbows out and put them in another body of water where they'll be able to flourish, and then we'll be able to use those to repopulate other streams in the park, on the reservation, and perhaps, on the national forest lands around, which we've already been approached about partnership on. Next slide, please. So the other way you can think about this is, okay, if you can't really deal with the invasives, you're just spending money weeding them, which I'd argue is still worthwhile. We were willing to accept that in a host of other natural resource arenas, keeping invasive species at a low level so they don't take over the ecosystem. But then what's the workaround? Well, the other thing you can do is get them out of harm's way, so you're not trying to manage around the non-native fish that are there. And with partnership from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey, a graduate student named Ben Galloway did a project for us assessing the potential for translocation of bull trout into waters that don't contain invasive lake trout, because that's sort of the one constant where you see lake trout introduced into bull trout habitat, the bull trout decline. It's widely accepted. It's a problem that's being faced all over the range of bull trout essentially, and it's not just bull trout. Lake trout come in and they're eating kokanee in Idaho. They're damaging recreational fisheries in other parts of the western U.S., places like Utah and so forth. So it's a widely recognized problem. With this graduate student's guidance, we were able to identify a place on the west side of the park initially to implement this project, to implement one of these projects. So if I could have the next slide, please. So Camas and Evangeline Lakes, for those of you that are familiar with the west side of the park, they're in the North Fork river drainage, pretty much right where the Camas Road meets the North Fork Road. That's the Camas drainage. And then the Camas drainage has a waterfall about 2/3 of the way up, and that has prevented lake trout from getting into the upper system. And that's where bull trout and cutthroat trout now reside. But at the very top of the drainage, there's another non-native species that was planted in the park close to 100 years ago now, Yellowstone cutthroat trout, which is ironic because we're trying to conserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout throughout their range, but in Glacier Park, they hybridize with our native West Slope cutthroat trout and are a detriment to our West Slope cutthroat trout. So the notion of moving these bull trout rather, upstream into an area that has Yellowstone cutthroat trout makes a lot of sense. If there's going to be fish, in a water that was historically fishless, having a native fish there makes a lot of sense. So we partnered with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and we removed the Yellowstone cutthroat from Camas and Evangeline lakes. And we, for the past 4 years, have been stocking local source, genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout from the North Fork drainage, because the North Fork drainage is undergoing hybridization as well with rainbow trout. It's just expanding up into the system. So it wasn't just about creating sort of a random native fish refuge. We took locally sourced stock from both in the park and on the Forest Service to found this population. So they have a conservation value. We're conserving genetic diversity, as well as conserving genetically unaltered populations. And it's that sort of conserving that sort of diversity is really important going forward, because it represents the adaptive capacity of these species. And adaptive capacity is even more important when we consider the sort of massive changes that are going on in these ecosystems due to a changing climate. Adaptability is going to be critical. I fully think if they have enough time, they will be able to adapt, but it's providing that time that's really important. Next slide. So Gunsight Lake. So I was just talking about a project we did on the west side of the park. Now, the east side of the park is, if you visit the park, it always seems more sleepy. It doesn't get as much attention. But there are a lot of really important natural resources over there. And some of them have been undergoing pressures from non-native fish as well. So the St. Mary's system on the east side of the park is the only place in the United States where bull trout are found east of the Continental Divide. And there's also a number of small West Slope populations, cutthroat populations there as well, that are also being adversely impacted by hybridization. Whereas Gunsight Lake, located at the top of the St. Mary watershed, has invasive rainbow trout in it. They've been in there since the 1920s. But we're seeing hybridization downstream in our cutthroat. And not only that, the bull trout are now being hybridized by brook trout in the St. Mary system as well. And that's a new development. So again, the same theme applies here. If there's going to be fish in a fishless water body, at least they should, in my opinion, they should have some conservation value. And this habitat, this area, it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's uniquely positioned, but it faces to the northeast. It's high in elevation. It's got a lot of things that are going to make it one of our coldest lakes going forward, and least vulnerable to warming and the types of things that occur with climate change. And seeing as those fish species need such cold water, working with our partners, we decided that creating a situation where invasive species aren't an issue and giving these fish an opportunity to exist and persist in the future in some of the coldest, cleanest water we have in the park made a lot of sense. So the park went through the environmental review process. And again, working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the U.S. Geological Survey, we removed the rainbow trout this September using a fish toxicant called rotenone. And we're going to start repopulating that lake next year with local sourced West Slope cutthroat trout initially and mountain whitefish. And then later, once the West Slope cutthroat trout have established a reproducing population, take some bull trout from most likely either Cracker Lake or Slide Lakes on the east side of the park, because they have some unique life history adaptations that are more likely to have them stay and persist in Gunsight Lake when compared to some of the big migratory stocks that you might say are more likely to leave and try and use that migratory life history that's so strong in those populations as well. So next slide. So there's a lot of challenges facing fisheries, and we have to make some tough decisions. We try and balance those decisions. Not everything you do is popular with everyone, but again, we're just trying to take a balanced, responsible approach to managing fisheries in the park, because when we look at what's been done over the past 100 years or so, it's been stock fish and then don't do anything about what the non-native fish are their impacts to the native fish. And the writing's on the wall with that. You can see it all kinds of places outside of the park. The invasive fish species come in, they displace the natives, and our mission here is to try and conserve the natural and cultural resources in perpetuity for future generations. And these are some of the methods that we have at our disposal to do that. And again, I want to say thank you, and also just let you folks know this is Quartz Lake on the right, where we're doing that lake trout suppression. And this is our crew from this year on the left, and our intern Sally's in the middle there. But these folks work hard. They live in the Quartz cabin for the entire month of June, and then they're there now in October, and they're just getting their day started now, because the fall netting for lake trout has to occur at night, because that's when those fish come up on the spawning bed. So this cabin provides an opportunity for them to warm up when they come off the lake. My hats off to their great attitude. And again, thank you all. Thanks to the Conservancy and everyone who supports it for your support of the fisheries program. It's really been huge for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. And we'll no doubt get back to some questions about kind of this keystone species and in terms of how saving fish helps save bears and birds, and in this interconnectivity of all the work that we're gonna talk about tonight. So thank you for your hard work and for again being with us tonight. Next, we have Lisa Bate and Holly Holmes. Well, Lisa and Holly are truly the dynamic duo. I'll leave out puns about Batwoman here later, but recognized for her work with the Jack Potter Glacier National Park Stewardship Award, glacier wildlife biologist Lisa Bate has been here in Glacier since somewhere around 2008, I think, and has led during that career many cutting-edge projects, which we've been just delighted to help participate at least in some of those. Most recently, to explore the value of eDNA in advancing wildlife research. And her partner in this work is one of the emerging leaders in this field, Holly Holmes. She did her undergraduate work in fish, wildlife, and conservation biology at Colorado State, go Rams, and is currently a biological science technician in the park. And in the process is also, because she's not busy enough, completing her master's degree in wildlife biology at the University of Montana. So Lisa and Holly, take it away.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for the invite, and so glad to be here. A lot of people probably think that as a wildlife biologist at Glacier National Park, we have a big budget to do wildlife research, inventory, and monitoring, but that's not the case. And if it wasn't for the Conservancy and its donors, none of our wildlife work would happen. So a huge thank you for supporting our projects, and a special thank you to Barb Lancaster for recognizing the rock star budding biologist that Holly is, that allows her to pursue her master's right now. So this is investigating new non-invasive techniques for monitoring harlequin ducks and water birds. And who's the harlequin duck? They're actually a sea duck, emphasize sea duck. They spend most of their time on the coast. They're immensely strong swimmers, and they access a foraging resource no other species can in streams. Right there is whitewater. They can dive in that whitewater and find small fish, a lot of invertebrates. They love caddisfly larvae. They're more strictly confined to any other water than any other waterfowl species in the Northern Hemisphere. Next slide, please. And where do they live? They are a sea duck, so they molt in winter along the rocky coast, coastal shorelines in the Arctic and subarctic. But during the breeding season, they're unlike other ducks who migrate north-south. These guys migrate east-west, and they come east all the way to Glacier National Park to nest along fast-moving whitewater streams in the mountains. The males and females form their pair bonds on the coast, and the male will follow the female to her natal stream where she was born. And as far as we know, females only nest on their natal streams, and that's a big part of why they're a species of concern. Once they're extirpated or the population's lost on that stream, highly, highly unlikely it will ever be repopulated. Immediately after breeding, as early as the beginning of June, and when the females start incubating, the males return to the coast. That means that if for some reason she loses that clutch of eggs, there's no chance for a second clutch, like mallards can have 2-3 clutches in a year. Females will return later, either after a failed nest or attempt, or the chicks have fledged. Next slide, please. So we documented population declines both on the ocean, on their wintering and molting grounds, and also here in the breeding grounds, here in Glacier National Park and up in Banff. Aerial surveys show that the wintering grounds, the counts have been undergoing declines, and the same thing here in Glacier National Park. They're being threatened by climate change threats and human disturbance threats. These ducks tend to put their nest within 1 meter or a yard of the stream's edge. So if we have erratic stream runoff, they often lose their nest. Next slide, please. So current methods and why we're concerned about them. Previous long-term methods, survey methods, primarily it's like boots on the ground. We hike up, 2 people, do leapfrogging, trying to count how many ducks. But there are a lot of challenges with boots on the ground. They can be highly variable. Conditions can be outside of our control. Like anytime we have high water in May, our numbers are really low because the ducks are in backwaters where we can't access them or on other streams. And then spring runoff is a huge factor in what we see as far as counts. But the one thing, we do 4 counts for pair surveys and up to 6 brood counts of female with chicks. But every single time we do a survey, we get a different number. And a lot of the streams in Montana are only surveyed once every 5 years. So it's really hard for us to get our finger on the pulse of what's happening to harlequin ducks on their breeding streams. Next slide, please. So here's the links. You might ask, well, what's the links have to do with any of this? But years ago, the first time I ever heard of this thing called eDNA, environmental DNA, I was like, well, what's that? And they showed a picture of a lynx walking on snow, and then they collected the snow where the footprint was, and they could tell if it was a lynx or a mountain lion. And I was like, what? I can't even imagine that that's possible. And that was the first time I ever heard of eDNA. And I was like, wow, that just is going to open so many doors. That's going to be amazing. Fast track, a few years later, Alyssa Anderson, she did her master's here in Glacier National Park on lynx. She helped a lot with harlequin surveys before that, and that's how I knew her. But she started using camera traps along trails to see if she could get at occupancy and population numbers of lynx. And when I thought about that, I'm like, oh, maybe, the harlequins use streams. That's linear habitat. Lynx use linear habitat. And all of a sudden, the light bulbs were going off. And then Holly and I were talking. And next slide, please. We started, and Holly was interested in doing research. And I was like, okay, this is the person that we want to invest in to light that next generation of biologists on fire. And Holly is the right person for this project, and she's going to take it from here. Thanks, Holly.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction, Lisa and Doug. Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Holmes, and I am the graduate student working on this project. And so I'm excited to share more about it with you today. So the objective of this study, before we dive in, I guess I wanted to lay out the objectives of what we're doing. And so the main objective is that we're trying to investigate the efficacy of 3 non-invasive survey methods for detecting harlequin ducks on their breeding streams in the Northern Rockies. And so specifically non-invasive means methods that are not causing harm or stress to the animals. So we're not physically trapping or handling the birds, but instead we're detecting them in other ways. And this study also aims to serve as a basis for building a regional monitoring program of harlequin ducks in the region. Next slide. And so the 3 non-invasive survey methods that we are investigating are ground-based foot surveys, environmental DNA or eDNA, and game cameras. And I'll explain each of these methods in more detail as we go. Next slide. So ground-based foot surveys are historically the main way that we've monitored harlequin ducks, and they're essentially what they sound like. It's teams of observers walking upstream looking for harlequin ducks. And the most important thing about these surveys is that we have teams that are working together to ensure that at least one person always has eyes on the streams to ensure that no ducks are missed or double counted. But I would just like to say from my own personal experience with these surveys that we do our very best, but these surveys can be really challenging because conditions can be really variable. And it can be really easy to miss birds, even when you have multiple people looking for them. Okay, next slide. Okay, environmental DNA is our next method, and this is also probably the method that we're the most excited about, but it's also the method with the most unknowns that we're still sort of working through. So what is DNA? And so it is, or what is eDNA? It's where we extract DNA from the environment. So DNA comes from anything that's left off an individual that contains cells. So this could be saliva, feces, feathers, poop, dander, you name it. And these cells are present all over our environment because animals, including us, are always sloughing off cells. And so some brilliant people figured out that maybe we can identify who's around by taking environmental samples and analyzing them for DNA. So an environmental sample can include stuff like collecting water, snow, swabs on flowers, and even air samples have been used to look for DNA in the environment. So in our case, we're using water and streams as our environment to try and see if we can pick up harlequin ducks that might be present. And as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, harlequin ducks are strictly confined to running water, which works to our benefit because streams are moving. And so we thought maybe streams could act as sort of a conveyor belt of DNA in which we could pick up ducks that are farther upstream than maybe we can walk or move. And so last thing I sort of wanted to clear up about eDNA, because I get this question a lot, is it is not like a 23andMe situation. It can only tell us presence or not detected. So it can tell us, yes, we saw DNA or harlequin ducks, or they weren't detected, but it can't tell us individual birds. So we won't know if we got the same bird on multiple samples or not. Okay, next slide. And so this technology is really exciting. And so I just want to give some pros and cons of why we're considering using it. So some of the pros are that we don't actually have to physically see harlequin ducks to detect it. And then also we won't have to navigate the whole stream, making this method a lot safer for surveyors than walking upstreams. And also, like I said in the last slide, we may be able to pick up harlequin ducks farther upstream than we're able to walk. So it really broadens the scope of which we're able to survey. Some of the cons are that it can be quite time consuming. Each sample can be 15 to 20 minutes. Also, the results are not real time. We collect these samples and then we have to send it to the genomics lab. And so we do get these results back in the winter, but it can help us make more informed management decisions for the next year. It just doesn't, it just won't help us in the current year that we're doing it. And finally, the equipment is heavy, but we're tough and it's not a big deal. Okay, next slide. So game cameras are our third methods, and they're really great because they allow for detection of species that would not be seen using other methods due to animal behavior or human error. But game cameras are not typically used on harlequin ducks. So because of that, we wanted to test two different methods of game cameras. And so therefore, we placed 2 cameras every river mile, and one camera was programmed to take pictures every 5 minutes on a time lapse, and the other camera was programmed to just take motion trigger photos. Oh. Okay, next slide. So game cameras can be really great because they can be left out for a longer period of time, whereas with foot surveys and eDNA, it's more of a snapshot because we're only out there for one day doing a foot survey or one day collecting eDNA, where game cameras are more of a continuum over time, and they're not as reliant on people detecting the birds because they're not worried about, like, game cameras aren't worried about slipping and sliding in the creek. And so you just set them and they'll take photos for you. However, they do require a lot more effort than some of the other methods because they do need to be retrieved at some point, and then we also do have to sort through photos on the back end, which can sometimes be quite extensive. And also game cameras, they're not typically used on running water and on waterfowl, and this is probably for a reason. And so something we've learned from this study is we do have to be really thoughtful about where we place cameras so that they're not just being triggered by running water, but also that they'll get triggered by animals. But through this project, we've picked up quite a few photos of harlequin ducks, so they are working. And so we're really excited about that. Okay, next slide. Okay, before moving on to some of our results, I just wanted to give kind of a general layout of what a survey on this project would look like, just because I think it'll help clear up a little bit of the terminology I'm going to use when I talk about some of the results we have. And so we surveyed 10 streams across Montana and Idaho 2 times in both 2022 and 2023. And so the first site visit was conducted when we would expect to see females that would either still be nesting or chicks that are just fledging. So this is early July through early August. And the second surveys happened when we would expect to see females with broods. So this is late July and late August. And now each site visit consisted of 3 days where we completed 3 surveys. So that's kind of the main difference I wanted to make, is we went to all 10 streams for 3 days each, and on each 3 days was 3 surveys. And so on each of the surveys, or each of the site visits, each day was a little different. So we did 3 ground-based foot surveys. And on the first day, we did a ground-based foot survey, and we would also put up game cameras. On the second day, we would do a ground-based foot survey, and we would take eDNA. And then on the third day, we would just do a ground-based foot survey. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now I'm excited to dive into more of the exciting part, which is some of the results that we're getting. Next slide. Okay, so the ground-based foot surveys, this was really cool. So in 2022, we had 21 site visits, and on 14 of those 21 site visits, we saw harlequin ducks. But of those 14 site visits, we only saw harlequin ducks on 8 of them on all 3 days of the surveys. And similarly, in 2023, this past summer, we completed 19 site visits and we saw harlequin ducks on 13 of them. But this year we only saw harlequin ducks all 3 days on 5 of those 13 site visits. And so in total in 2022, we saw 120 harlequin duck detections. And then this year we had 144. And now the detection is not necessarily total harlequins, because like I said, we were surveying for 3 days in a row. So we could have seen the same harlequin duck multiple days. It was just total detections. And I'll talk a little bit about why this is important. Okay, next slide. But the main takeaway of this information that I'm sharing is that we get different counts of harlequin ducks every single day. These site visits, they consisted of the exact same 2 observers surveying the exact same stretch of stream 3 days in a row, and yet we see different numbers of ducks on each survey. And so this is consistent with what biologists like Lisa are concerned about when using this method as a long-term monitoring method, especially at a larger scale, where oftentimes a stream might only get visited for 1 day every 5 years. Okay, next method, eDNA. So eDNA, in 2022, we collected 341 samples. 190 of those samples were positive for harlequin ducks. So that's roughly 55% of our samples had harlequin duck DNA. But the thing that was the most exciting is we had positive eDNA for harlequin ducks on every single stream, even the streams we did not see ducks in our foot surveys. And then this year in 2023, we collected 382 eDNA samples. And like I said, at the cons where it's not real time, but we'll have our results back by January, and I'm excited to see what this year has. Next slide. So the main eDNA takeaway is that eDNA is proving to be really promising, and it's a really good reminder that all because we don't see something with our eyes doesn't mean that it's not there. And yeah. Next slide. So then game camera data. So last year we deployed 106 cameras and collected roughly 1,453,423 photos, which is an outrageous amount of photos. And I'll tell you how we're gonna go through all of those. This year we put out 92 cameras and collected roughly 875,000 photos. Next slide. So the next steps with the game cameras. So right now we are actually working with an artificial intelligence program that's helping us sort through the empty images to reduce the workload of sorting through images, because there's roughly 2.5 million photos that we've collected in the last 2 years, and that takes a lot of time to sort through that. So we need all the help we can get. And so currently I have been working, I'm a master's student here at the University of Montana, like I said before, and so I've been working with an undergrad to bring her onto this project. And she's going to help sort through these photos, and she's also helping me assess the efficacy of the AI in detecting Harlequin. So making sure that we're not getting a bunch of false negatives. And this is something I'm really excited about because I personally have had a ton of really great mentors like Lisa. And so I'm excited to keep passing on some of the mentoring and bring her into the Glacier family. Next slide. And so the survey effort, I show this slide because this project is hugely collaborative and it could not be done without the support of all of these different agencies, especially the Glacier National Park Conservancy. And in total, we've had 65 people conduct surveys. 40 surveys have been completed over the last 2 years, which totals 119 days of people just walking upstreams looking for ducks. And in total, over 2,000 hours of people slipping and sliding their way up the streams. And so it's been a hugely collaborative effort, and yeah, it cannot be done without every single person and the support of everyone here. Okay, next slide. And so what are our next steps with this project? So currently I'm working on taking all this data and trying to understand what we can learn from it. And so the goal is to provide an understanding of how well each of these methods work to detect Harlequin ducks, given they're present on a stream. And then using this information and all the historical information we have about Harlequin ducks, I'm working on building a region-wide predictive occupancy map of Harlequin ducks that can help biologists identify potentially important breeding streams that we're maybe unaware of. And then we can continue using the best methods that we're learning about right now to continue monitoring Harlequin ducks and to better understand their population trends as we move forward. And the other really awesome thing about this project is Harlequin ducks are kind of acting as this species where if we can learn how to study them, it will probably open up the door to studying many other species of concerned water birds that live in really harsh environments like Harlequin ducks. Next slide. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you.
Wow, thank you. And I know I speak for this larger group that if Holly is any indication of our future, it is in really good hands. And Lisa, thank you for being such an incredible advocate and mentor. Even in my short tenure here at the Conservancy, it has really mattered to have a strong voice at the park advocating for this kind of cutting edge research. So thank you both for that. We're going to spend a little more time. As you know, I'm quite a timekeeper, but I think that we just have such a robust sharing going on right now. I'm going to ask people to hang in with us a little past the 7 o'clock hour so that we can make sure to get some questions in. So maybe we'll spend an extra 15 or 20 minutes or so together. If you have to leave, understood. Texas is playing Houston tonight after all. But we hope you'll hang in there with us. We also do record this and we'll make it available tomorrow on our YouTube channel, and we'll be emailing that out. So Holly and Lisa, thanks again for a terrific and thought-provoking presentation. We're next going to kind of talk to the podcasters here a little bit. A winner of the 2022 Freeman Tilden Award for the Intermountain region, which is the highest interpretation awards presented by the National Park Service in recognition of outstanding contributions to the profession of interpretation. The Headwaters podcast is now in its 3rd season and it's the only project with its own swag, right, Michael?
Oh yeah, I'm repping. It's a very comfortable hoodie.
Very good. And available on glacier.org, and Andrew's going to try and work out some sort of a coupon, but there will be a link in the chat for you. So Michael Feist and Perry Sassnet both started their careers in the National Park Service at about the same time. Perry in 2013 with stints in Grand Teton, Yosemite, and Grand Canyon. I think I have that right. Before coming to Glacier, finally finding your way home in 2017. And Michael really stuck it out. He got here in 2014 and if rumor has it, you got the grand job of answering the phones in the headquarters building.
Yeah.
So thank you for sticking with that. He's worked in a number of important roles in education and interpretation, leading him to help co-found the Headwaters podcast now 3 seasons ago. And we're really excited to, again, be raising money this year for season 4 of Headwaters next year. So Michael and Perry, take it away.
Thanks so much, Doug, and thanks everybody here for having us. That was a great introduction. Saves us a lot of trouble of explaining who we are. We could do the next slide. This topic or this presentation is going to cover, what Headwaters is, how it got started, what we've worked on in the past. We've actually put out 3 seasons already. We're working on the 4th this year. And then we'll talk about what's coming next. So for starters, Perry, you can introduce yourself.
Doug covered most of it, but I'm Perry Sassnet, and this is my 5th season in Glacier and my 3rd season working on the podcast.
Yeah.
Go to the next slide.
And as Doug said, I've been around at Glacier for going on 10 years now, but this is my 4th season working on Headwaters, which is really exciting. Next slide. We are 2 members of a larger team that includes others in this photo. On the far right, Daniel Lombardi. He is kind of the mastermind that got working with the Conservancy originally to get this project started. Next to him is our coworker, Gabby Esaveri. She was brought on to the project through a winter fellowship funded by the Conservancy. And then not included in this photo are Melissa Sladek, and if you go to the next slide, former team members that include, this is the back of Andrew Smith's head, who now works for the Conservancy.
We miss you, Andrew.
Miss him very much. But yeah, essentially, one of the goals at the beginning of this project is, why make a podcast? And part of it was we listened to podcasts, and there weren't many options like it in national parks. But also, according to research from Pew, like half of Americans listen to podcasts on a regular basis. And spend more time with them than most people do any other medium. So that was kind of the inspiration for why. Any other reasons?
It's a lot of fun to make a podcast. We'll tell you a little bit more about some of the behind the scenes tidbits as we keep going. But yeah, they're one of our favorite statistics is just how long people listen to our episodes. Like most listeners listen all the way through, which is very hard to come by, whether that's, for other online journalism, whether it's for online videos. So that's, you have listeners' ears for a while, and that's really important to us.
Yeah, we could do next slide. Those are kind of the reasons why we wanted to make a podcast. This is some background on the seasons we've worked on, in the past. It started in 2020 with season 1, which felt like an appropriate time to try to bring the park to other people. And season 1, what we called Confluence, worked on with Andrew. We went to every major region of the park and told stories that captured the essence of that area. So we had a story, or an episode at Logan Pass, an episode at Many Glacier, episode at Goat Haunt, all over the place, covering the stories of each region. That was in 2020. And then next slide.
So season 2, we worked on in 2021, and that was my first season on the podcast. And we covered, unlike season 1, which had different episodes and different stories that, all tell the story of Glacier, but were pretty kind of standalone. Season 2 was a single story told in 5 episodes, and that was the story of White Bark Pine. So it looks at why it matters and why it's dying, and the people and the restoration effort the effort that's going into trying to save this species. And it turned out to be really timely because whitebark pine was added to the endangered species list late last year. The Glacier Conservancy has supported a ton of whitebark pine work in the park over the years. And so if you've heard about that, if you're curious about it and want to learn more, season 2 is a great place to start.
Yeah. And then just last summer in 2022, we worked on season 3, which we called Becoming, which was this 9-part deep dive onto history in Glacier before this place became a national park. So we told stories ranging from history of the War on Wolves in Northwest Montana, history of the Polbridge Mercantile through the guy who helped found it, and a bunch of other really fascinating stories tackled from all sorts of different angles. So over the course of the 3 years we've been making this show up till now, we've tried to do something different every year, tell stories that not just our listeners, the public, hasn't heard before, but stories that park rangers haven't heard before. And, having worked here before working on this job, we have a decent idea of the stories that are common that you'll hear at a campground talk, and the stories that will raise your eyebrows. Like, what are you talking about? So those are the 3 seasons we've worked on so far. And if we go to the next slide, we could talk a little bit about what goes into each episode.
Yeah, so I will say that I think I can speak for the whole team when I say that our favorite part of the job is all of the amazing people that we get to meet and interview and learn from as we put together a season. So this is just a small number of the people that we've talked to over the years, but we actually counted and we've interviewed over 100 people throughout 4 seasons.
Including Lisa Bate several times.
Many times over. Thank you, Lisa. So yeah, it's definitely my favorite part. And it's kind of one of the unique things about podcasts is that you get to hear from these people in their own voices. It's not mediated through, maybe I quote you in an article, but it's still coming through my voice or something like that. You get to hear directly from people who, most of us would never get to encounter or meet these people in our daily lives, whether, some of the people on the slide, like Shelton Johnson, he lives in Yosemite. So, yeah, it's just a great opportunity to get to meet these people and then get to share their voices with our listeners. You can go to the next slide.
So we talk to a lot of people to help the show be better, to hear from more perspectives and make it more engaging. But we also have the flexibility to work directly with artists, both print artists and musicians pictured here, to help give the show an air of professionalism and emotional weight that it wouldn't have if we were left to score the show in addition to creating it. So on the top left is artist Claire Emery, who created the woodblock print we used for season 2's cover art in the middle there. Also on the hoodie, it's this really beautiful painting of a whitebark pine. I promise I'm not trying to shill the sweater, but it's this really wonderful painting. She allowed us to use it on our cover art, and we got to interview her as Perry hiked up to see a whitebark pine with her. On the right, we've worked with contemporary pianist, musician Ben Cosgrove, and the bottom right, an Indigenous rapper, musician, and music producer Frank Wallen, who scored our season last year, season 3. And season 3's cover art was designed by Eric Carlson in the bottom left. So it's a really cool opportunity to collaborate with creative, passionate people, and all of whom have been really excited to work with us. And using their work has helped our show sound better. It helped it look better.
It certainly helped us see our season in a new light through working with these artists.
I remember in season 1, Andrew and I were figuring it out as we went along. And then the moment we put Ben's music under it, it's like, oh my gosh, it sounds like we know what we're doing. So
Often that happens.
Next slide.
So it's all very fun to go out in the field with people and sit down for interviews and work with artists and musicians. But by this time of year, most of our time is spent staring at a screen like this. This is Adobe Audition. And yeah, it takes a lot of work to find the story in the edit, so to say. Just, yeah, sitting down with all the tape that you've collected. An interview might last an hour, 2 hours, and then to cut that down into a 10-minute conversation or just a handful of little snippets that are kind of those best key moments is a lot of work, but it's also a very rewarding process to see the episodes start to come together. You can go to the next slide.
And all this work has seemed to pay off. In the years since season 1 came out in December of 2020, we've had over 20,000 listeners on the platforms that we have analytics on who've listened to over 50,000 hours worth of the show. It's aired on Montana Public Radio in their documentary slot, just like it sounds like Chris Downs' work has been on Montana Public Radio, so we're in good company. And then, as Doug highlighted at the beginning, we recently were awarded the 2022 Regional Freeman Tilden Award for season 2 on White Bark Pine. So Andrew also gets credit for that one. Next slide.
So what's next? So this year we've been working on season 4. This is the cover art, which was created by Stella Nall. And this is the first time we have an animal kind of front and center on the cover art. And that is because season 4 will dive into life in Glacier, the people of Glacier and the wildlife of Glacier and more. If you go to the next slide, I can tell you a little bit more about a story I've been working on for season 4, which is about black swifts. They are one of Glacier's more mysterious creatures. They nest behind waterfalls.
They're a bird.
Oh yeah, they're birds. They nest behind waterfalls. They forage really high up, over 10,000 feet. So you're not going to sort of accidentally see one flying around. And so if you want to get a glimpse of them, you have to start hiking at about 4 a.m. to reach some of those waterfalls before sunrise where they nest. But that habitat is kind of steadily shrinking as the climate is warming. So there's been a lot of work, some of it supported by the Conservancy, to learn more about these birds and about their habitat to see how they're doing. So the episode follows along as I try to see a swift with Amy's help. This is Amy and I in the photo. And she has worked on studying black swifts in Glacier for the last 10 years. And here she's explaining to me what a swift looks like. They're all black, and she's showing me there's a little bit of white on their forehead. And the episode kind of asks some questions about these lesser known species in the park. We all think a lot about, talk a lot about, study grizzly bears, mountain goats, these charismatic species, and they get a lot of attention. And Amy said it to me. She said it really nicely. She was like, it's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one was there, did it make a sound? It's like if a black swift disappears from a waterfall and no one, what does that mean? Like, why does that matter? And yeah, so we're kind of exploring that idea and what swifts mean to Glacier. So you can go to the next slide.
I was not envious of that field day getting up at 3 a.m. But I've been working on a story this year about bear spray. It's something I've carried for 10 years since living here. It's something I've made a whole story for season 1 about how to use safely. But I didn't know where it came from. I didn't know the origin story of bear spray. I'd heard little pieces here and there. And so diving into it this year took me to the Counter Assault Bear Spray factory located right here in the Flathead Valley. And it took me to some pretty surprising places that this story really starts here in Glacier, more than I expected it to. I thought it'd be a fun story, but it turned out to be one that was really relevant to Glacier, both today and in the past. And it's one I'm excited for everybody to get a chance to hear. On to the next slide.
So in addition to season 4, we were like, that's not enough work. Let's also do season 5 at the same time. So season 5 is a series of interviews, kind of conversation style, with a variety of experts on different facets of climate change. So we're talking to people who study glaciers and people who interpret climate change.
And those things happen with Al Gore's interweb. It appears as though perhaps have lost our podcasters. We'll see if perhaps we can re-engage them, but I can assure you, having the overall look, we were one slide away from the end. I have to say, I've long been told that I have a face for radio, but it is always interesting for me to think about the podcasting. Glacier is a very visual park, and part of the magic here is how they've turned radio into something that paints a really vivid picture. And I think it's a really incredible thing that they're doing. And we're very proud to support it. Again, it's one of those things that just straight up would not be happening at Glacier or in other parks without private philanthropy. So thank you for doing that. What incredible presentations. We're going to take a few minutes of overtime here to turn it over to Lacey Kowalski, our Associate Director for Programs and Policy here at the Conservancy. Lacey, I can see, has been taking notes of all of the many very good questions that have come up. And Lacey, I'm going to turn it over to you to get some questions.
Okay, thank you, Doug. I have a good handful of questions about the eDNA project. So I think that caused a lot of interest for folks. I'm going to throw you kind of a two-parter. So Margaret was curious if there's any expectation that the eDNA technology will improve to the point that individuals can be identified, similar to the Bear DNA project. And also kind of along those lines, what is the time frame of the viability for the eDNA to be useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not heard of them like looking at, like to be able to identify individuals, but I feel like it's kind of one of those things that's maybe just like it's probably coming down the line, and I imagine it would be, because that would be extremely helpful, especially with conservation when you're thinking about abundance of species, because right now we can really just get presence or absence, like yes, they're here, they're not here, but being able to identify to the individual level would be able to get at like how many ducks are here, how many individuals. So I imagine that sort of technology is in the works. At the moment it's not there, and I don't really know what a timeline would be for that. And then yeah, the viability part is a really great question, and that is part of the like many unknowns that we don't know at the moment, and we're working to figure it out. And so when we're taking eDNA, we were also taking quite a few different environmental variables as well. So we were measuring like how wide the stream is, what we were measuring the stream flow, the benthic substrate. So like, is it sandy or is it rocky or is it boulders? Because all of these things, there's been lots of studies done using eDNA that have looked at different environmental factors that really affect how far DNA can be or can travel in a stream system. And as far as once we have collected the DNA, as far as I know, it seems to be viable almost indefinitely. It gets frozen and saved, and it goes into this bigger eDNA atlas. And so then anyone who's looking to use eDNA, what they can do is they can go into this atlas and see where all of these samples have been collected. And samples can be analyzed for up to 8 different species. So it can be analyzed 8 different times. And so people could go and look at where we took samples, or we could go look where they might say, hey, I want to have your sample analyzed for my species. And as long as, and then the genomics lab will check with us and we can say, yeah, absolutely. And then this DNA can, or this sample can be analyzed for more than just one species.
That's amazing.
And
Wow.
Lacey, I see that we have Michael and Perry back. I did, tell everyone in your absence that they could just show up anytime and be part of the podcast. So I hope that's okay. But I want to hand it back over to you. I know we were close. I know we were close to the end, and if you want to wrap up for a moment, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I felt like the long pole that yanks people off stage at the Oscars was yanked on us. We're not sure what happened, but we don't really need to close out on any other slides. We were just wrapping up the projects we had this year, season 4, about life in Glacier and a series of climate interviews, and then next year being look into mid-century history in Glacier, untold stories from the middle of the 20th century. So yeah, that's it. The final slide was just kind of highlighting some great reviews because we were never
nice things that people said about us.
We weren't sure if people were going to listen to this, but not only have visitors seemed to really grasp on it, local businesses like Glacier Hip Camp have embraced it. We've run into park staff who are starting their very first season working in Glacier and had listened to season 1 to get a lay of the land, who listened to season 2 and fallen in love with whitebark pine. So
and if you want to leave us nice reviews in your podcast app, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, it was just a really cool project. We're really grateful to get to work on it, and it's thanks to all of you in this call. So yeah, we're done.
No, it's really remarkable, and I think that if memory serves, at one point you guys were stuck on the Apple Podcast ratings, just below National Geographic and just above Bill Nye the Science Guy, which makes me understand why
crazy
it looks so grouchy. But no, congratulations. This is really fun stuff, and it's neat to, again, to your point of people who listen to podcasts, we need to have people who are supporting national parks be the next generation. And that's, I have 2 adult children. It's all about the podcast for them, and being able to share this information with folks is really cool. Next year, by the way, the 90th anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt's trip up the Going to the Sun Highway on August 3rd, 1934. Well, so thank you again. And Lacey, back to you with questions.
Okay, I have 2 more for Lisa and Holly. First of all, can you tell us, is the Harlequin duck foot survey done via the citizen science program, and are there ways that folks can get involved in that?
No, it's actually not. It's through the wildlife program. And if people are interested, they usually contact me. And there is a vetting procedure because it's not on trail. You have to be willing to bushwhack through Hawthorne, Devil's Club, all kinds of things. It's not always easy until we do brood surveys. And that's when we call it a walk in the park, because we walk in the stream. But it's not really easy and some people love it, and some people like, well, no, I don't want to do that again. So, but if they're interested, they can reach out to me. Thank you.
So you're looking for very dedicated people.
Yes, with good
okay.
eyes.
Yes, and steady feet. Last question I have is, could you just tell us a little bit about what the funding for your project is used for? And what is required for it, like how much you're looking for and what it's used for?
So a lot of the funding is for staff, but a lot of equipment. Actually, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks has stepped forward to buy a lot of the equipment. They're paying for all the eDNA, all the cameras and batteries and things like that. A lot of the funding is for Holly to allow her to do research and to look through those millions of photos in the winter. And also it funds her time in the summer. So salaries, equipment, and research, I would say.
Thank you. And that's all the questions I have. But if anyone's got anything lingering, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting. As we've talked earlier tonight. Tomorrow we have a board meeting, and our board meeting, we're going to, thanks to you, be able to recommend that our board announce the release of a record amount of funding at this time for the park, to let them know that they can be rest assured that $2.6 million worth of projects are going to happen next year. It's really an amazing thing. Now, we're not done yet, and you'll no doubt be hearing from us, and we're going to need the additional support to meet our $3.2 million obligation to the park this year. But to Lisa's point, it does fund people, and that's great. As I said earlier, that it is, without the people in green and gray, they are the people who make the magic happen here in the park, and we are the conduit to help make sure that there are people. Without people, there are no projects, right? You've met those people tonight. I've gotten texts and emails about, Chris Downs is amazing. It's like, yeah, and I'm glad you had a chance to meet him, right? And so connecting people and purpose and park is, I guess, the privilege that we have here at the Conservancy, and I'm so very thankful for everybody and all of the work that that you as donors make possible, and that you, our partners in the park, help us to put in place through philanthropic giving. So thank you all for being with us tonight. Thanks for hanging in there for 15 extra minutes. Again, if there's any information you need, I hope that everybody has gotten their funding needs guide. It's my working copy. If you haven't, let me know. It's also online. And really just, we so appreciate the privilege of doing this work, and hope that you'll maybe join us on the next Glacier Book Club, which is going to be about the Conservation Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps in Montana, and that's in late November. We're going to have about 6 of these Glacier Conversations every year, and also about 6 Glacier Book Club events where the authors always join us for those as well. So we look forward to remaining in community with you. And in the meantime, if there's anything we can ever do, please just email any of us. We're all first name at glacier.org. So we're easy to get in touch with. Thank you all so very much. Have a happy and safe remainder of the fall. Good luck with the raking. And we'll look forward to seeing you all very soon. Good night, everybody.